In the year 86 BC, on the plains of Boeotia, the largest army that Grecia had seen in generations advanced with a steady step toward its destiny. They were men from Ponto and Thracia, from Ossetia and Cappadocia, from Bithynia, Galatia, and Phrygia. 12 distinct nations under a single banner, tens of thousands of soldiers convinced they would crush a fragmented, exhausted Roman army far from any reinforcements. King Mithridates, Sexto of Ponto, had sent the best of his forces to erase Roma from Greek soil, and his general Archelaus believed that nothing in the world could stop them. But what awaited them on that plain was not fear. It was not surrender. It was a general who had decided that no army in the world would make him retreat. From the heights of the hill of Parapotamio, Lucius Sulla contemplated the valley with cold and calculating eyes. His legionaries were fewer, far fewer, but they had forged something that no Eastern army had ever managed to destroy: Roman discipline in its most brutal and perfect expression. And when the war chariots with rotating blades charged against the Roman lines, the ranks opened as if by order of destiny. Projectiles fell from the flanks. The Pontic phalanx stumbled against the rocky terrain and the chaos of their own fleeing comrades. Sulla raised his arm. The Roman cavalry charged from the right like an iron hammer. The Pontic left disintegrated. The center had nowhere to flee. Cries in 10 different languages mingled with the dust and blood of the Boeotian valley. Overturned chariots, banners sunk in the mud, the Cephiso River blocking the retreat of those still trying to escape. When the sun began to set over the hills of Chaeronea, the army that should have erased Roma from Grecia no longer existed. Only 10,000 of Mithridates' soldiers managed to reach the sea, and the echo of that afternoon would resonate to the ends of the ancient world. The 1st century BC was a time of fractures. Roma looked inward, with eyes burning with civil rage, while its borders cracked from the outside. The social war against the Italic allies had bled the army dry. The factions of Mario and Sulla disputed control of the Republic with a hatred that would make Roman blood run in the very streets of the most powerful city on earth. And in that moment of mortal distraction, from the distant shores of the Mar Negro, an ancient and ambitious king saw his opportunity. Mithridates, Sexto Eupator, king of Ponto, was no ordinary monarch. He was a man who had survived conspiracies since childhood, who spoke 22 languages, according to the testimonies of his contemporaries, and who had studied the campaigns of Alejandro with the devotion of a strategist seeking his own model of conquest. He knew Roma. He knew its legions, its structures, its weak points. And when Roma looked the other way, he acted with a decisiveness that would shake the Mediterranean world to its foundations. In the year 88 BC, his armies swept through the Roman provinces of Asia Minor with a speed that left the Republic stunned. The cities that had lived under Roman administration for decades opened their gates to the Pontic soldiers, hailing them as liberators. The resentment accumulated against Roman tax collectors had been boiling for years, and Mithridates knew exactly how to open the valve. And then something happened that Roma could never forget nor forgive. In a single day, in an act coordinated across dozens of cities, the local populations turned against the Roman and Italic residents. Ancient historians speak of 80,000 victims on that terrible day that would go down in history as the Vespers Asiaticas. Citizens dragged from their homes, merchants executed in their shops. Even those who took refuge in the temples were killed without hesitation. It was a message written in blood. The king of Ponto was not coming to negotiate. The general Archelaus crossed the Egeo and took a position in Atenas, whose anti-Roman party welcomed him with open arms. The strategos Aristion handed the city over to Ponto, and soon almost all of central Grecia seemed to bow before Mithridates. The cities of Boeotia sent delegations of allegiance. The ports opened to the Pontic fleet. Roma seemed like a distant shadow. But Roma does not forget. And Roma does not forgive. The response would arrive with a man capable of sustaining the weight of that war, without sufficient resources, without political support, and without any possible retreat. That man was Lucio Cornelio Sulla. Sulla was not a man who inspired affection. He was a man who inspired obedience. Born into a patrician family of diminished fortune, he had risen through his own talent, his strategic coldness, and an almost supernatural disposition for transforming adversity into tactical advantage. His face, marked by a skin condition that made him distinguishable among all his peers, was the face of someone accustomed to others looking away. He never did. Never. He had fought under Mario in Numidia, and it was precisely Sulla who captured King Jugurtha through bold political negotiation, an achievement he would fiercely claim throughout his life, and which forever poisoned his relationship with his former mentor. He had fought against the Cimbri and the Teutons in northern Italia, and he had demonstrated in every campaign that he understood something many generals took decades to learn: that discipline sustained in the darkest moment is worth more than twice the number of men without it. He was superstitious in a way that baffled his more rational officers. He believed in omens, consulted haruspices, and devotedly kept a small figure of Apollo that never left him during campaigns. And yet, his tactical mind was as cold as winter steel. Within Sulla lived both the man who asked the gods for signs and the strategist who needed no one to read a battlefield. In the year 87 BC, Sulla landed in Graecia at the head of 5 legions with approximately 15,000 Roman legionaries, plus Greek allied contingents. They came from an unresolved civil war, from endless marches, from promises rather than regular pay. But they were his men, and they followed him because they believed in him with that loyalty that only arises when a general proves he can win what seems impossible to win. His first major task was Atenas. For months, his legions besieged the city and the port of Pireo with implacable methodology. He cut down the sacred groves of the Academia to build siege engines and diverted rivers to deprive the defenders of water. And on the 1st of March, in the year 86 BC, the walls gave way. Sulla stopped the slaughter before the temples could be profaned, saying that he forgave the living in honor of the dead, in honor of the great names that city had given to the world. But Archelaus had escaped. The Pontic general evacuated his troops by sea and headed north, where another army of Mithridates was advancing from Macedonia under the command of General Taxilo to join him. And when both forces met, what awaited Sulla was of a dimension that made any prudent calculation pale. Tens of thousands of soldiers from 12 nations, with heavy cavalry, horse archers, Macedonian phalanx infantry, and 60 war chariots with rotating blades designed to cut through entire formations like a scythe cuts through wheat. Sulla followed the Pontic army north with full awareness that the coming encounter would be completely different from the siege of Atenas. In the open field, facing tens of thousands of soldiers with cavalry superiority, something more than courage and discipline was needed. The right battlefield was needed. Geography was needed as an ally. Boeotia was a region of wide plains crossed by hills and cut by the Cephiso River, terrain that favored an army with superiority in cavalry and war chariots, exactly the type of army Archelaus commanded. To accept battle on an open plain would be to hand the advantage to the enemy before any Roman drew his sword. Sulla understood this with crystal clarity and patiently sought the place where geography would level the equation. He found it near Chaeronea, a city that held in its collective memory a previous battle of equal historical greatness. In the year 338 BC, on that same Boeotian soil, Filippo II of Macedonia and his young son Alejandro had crushed the Greek coalition, forever changing the course of Hellenic history. Now, 152 years later, another army awaited its destiny in that same valley of dust and memory. Sulla studied the terrain with the meticulousness of one who knows that every meter can be the difference between victory and annihilation. To the north of Chaeronea, Monte Acontio ran parallel to the Cefiso River, forming a natural wall that compressed the available space. To the south, Monte Turio raised its rugged slopes over the plain. Between both elevations, the valley narrowed at critical points that would make the enemy's numerical advantage absurd. The scythed chariots needed space, speed, and flat ground to reach their full destructive power. In that irregular and constrained valley, they would be little more than aimless iron and wood. The decisive move came when both forces competed to occupy the Acropolis of Parapotamio, an elevated position that dominated the passage of the Cefiso toward the city, and which Plutarch would describe as nearly impregnable. Sulla sent his men before Archelaus could do so. It was a race against the clock, and the Romans won it. From that height, Sulla could see the entire field. He could see his legions. He could wait. Meanwhile, Archelaus made the mistake that would seal his fate. He attempted to directly occupy the city of Chaeronea to cut Roman communication lines. But to get there from his position, the Pontic forces had to go around the mountain and enter the valley from the north, exactly the corridor Sulla already controlled from Parapotamio. Sulla responded by sending the legate Gabinio with a full legion to occupy the city before the enemy arrived. Once again, the Romans arrived first. The stage was set with the precision of a trap that had been laid for weeks. The two forces deployed in the narrow valley. Sulla took command of the Roman right flank. The legate Murena took charge of the left, the most exposed and vulnerable sector. Hortensio and Galba commanded the reserve cohorts in the rear. Facing them, Archelaus deployed his troops across the full width of the valley, the Macedonian phalanx in the center, numerous cavalry on the flanks threatening to envelop the Roman wings, and in the vanguard, the 60 war chariots with their iron blades gleaming under the Boeotian sun. They were more, far more, but they were enclosed in the terrain Sulla had chosen for them, like a hunting knife locked in a sheath that prevented it from moving. The morning dawned over Chaeronea with that deceptive clarity some Greek days have before the heat sets in. The Cefiso River murmured among the stones. The men of both armies observed each other from their positions with that mixture of fear and determination known only to those who have survived a battle and know with certainty what is to come. It was geography that fired the first shot before any arrow flew. The soldiers Sulla had sent around Monte Turio during the night unexpectedly appeared at the top of the hill, above the flank of the Pontic contingent stationed there. For Archelaus's men on that elevation, it was like seeing armed ghosts emerge from the very rock of the mountain. Panic spread in seconds. The Pontic soldiers began to scatter toward the valley, and their disordered flight collided directly with the formations waiting below, sowing confusion in the rear before Archelaus could give a single order. Archelaus responded with his most imposing weapon. The 60 chariots with rotating blades advanced toward the Roman center at a gallop, kicking up a cloud of reddish dust with the thunder of wheels on the dry earth and the metallic song of iron cutting through the air. They were machines of terror designed to spread panic and open deadly breaches in any formation that dared face them. But Sulla had foreseen exactly that move months in advance. His centurions had trained the men for this specific moment. The Roman ranks opened with calculated precision, creating perfect corridors through which the chariots passed without meeting resistance. And at the instant the speed of the chariots began to decrease, at the moment they became trapped between formations, the Roman velites surrounded them from both sides with javelins and slings. The drivers fell from their platforms. The horses turned aimlessly. Mithridates' chariots, weapons that had inspired terror in much larger armies, were reduced to splintered wood and twisted iron in a few minutes of methodical combat. The center became a field of brutal and incessant contact. The Pontic phalanx, formed according to the Macedonian model that had conquered the world in Alejandro's time, was a formidable war machine on open ground. Sarissa's 6 meters long created an almost impenetrable wall of iron that advanced with a terrible cadence, but the phalanx held a structural flaw that the Romans had learned to exploit. Its strength depended on its internal cohesion. In the irregular terrain of the valley, with the fugitives from Monte Turio disorganizing the rear ranks, that perfect cohesion was impossible to maintain during the heat of the fight. The Roman legionaries did not have the lethal length of the Sarissa, but they had the gladius, that short, double-edged sword that was more an instrument of systematic butchery than a weapon of honorable dueling, and they had the oval shield that turned each legionary into an individual fortress, capable of operating in spaces where the long spear became a hindrance. Where the phalanx sought irresistible frontal push, Roma sought the weak point, the exposed side, the space between shields. Where the phalanx needed geometric order, Roma functioned with a disciplined, brutal, and efficient chaos. On the Roman left, however, the situation became dangerous with a speed that alarmed the most veteran officers. Archelaus saw that Murena's flank was the most vulnerable link and launched his heavy cavalry against it with all the fury he had available. Hortensio, at the head of 5 reserve cohorts, went to the rescue. But Archelaus anticipated the move and enveloped those cohorts with his numerically superior cavalry. Hortensio was left fighting on 3 simultaneous fronts, in real and immediate danger of total collapse that would have opened a deadly gap in the Roman center. The news reached Sulla on the right flank, where his sector had not yet engaged in formal combat. The decision he made at that instant would define the battle. He abandoned his secure position, gathered his personal cavalry, and rode toward the left at a gallop with his banners unfurled, crossing the entire length of the battle line in view of friends and enemies. It was a gesture of calculated courage. Troops do not just follow the plan, they follow the man. Seeing their commander cross the field under danger was worth more than an entire cohort of reinforcements. His troops saw him arrive through the dust and the cries of combat. They cheered him, and Archelaus, observing the movement from his position, understood the strategic opportunity presented to him. If the Roman right had been left without its commander, it was the exact moment to strike. Archelaus disengaged his cavalry from the confrontation with Hortensio and launched it in an enveloping movement toward the Roman right flank. But Sulla had also calculated that counter-move, or perhaps he had deliberately provoked it as part of a tactical deception that only he could conceive with such coldness. As soon as Sulla stabilized the situation on the left, with Hortensio freed from the encirclement and the cohorts recovering their formation, he turned back without hesitation. He regrouped his cavalry, took 1 cohort from Hortensio and 2 others from the reserve, and returned at a trot to the right in time to find Archelaus attacking a flank that, far from being disordered, had stood firm with the discipline that distinguishes veterans from recruits. What followed was the systematic destruction of the Pontic left. Sulla's cavalry clashed with the forces sent to flank the Roman right, and the impact was devastating for a sector committed to its attack and without the possibility of reorganizing. Murena from the Roman left flank also regained offensive momentum and began to pressure the center of the phalanx with renewed aggressiveness. 2 simultaneous pressures from different angles now struck an army that was beginning to lose its internal structure. In the same narrow valley that Sulla had chosen so deliberately weeks before, the Pontic center gave way. The phalanx, which had fought with undeniable determination and bravery, suddenly found that its flanks had disappeared, that its reserves were retreating, and that the men to its left and right were running toward the camp in growing disorder. The discipline of the phalanx depends on a fundamental trust. the certainty that neighbors will hold their position no matter what. When that trust breaks, the phalanx does not retreat orderly. It disintegrates with the same speed as a wall whose foundations are removed with a single blow. The Pontic army began to crumble, first on the flanks, then in the center, then everywhere at once. The men who had advanced that morning convinced of victory were now pushing back against their own comrades, creating funnels of panic where the legionaries advanced without meeting organized resistance. Archelaus, according to Appiano and Plutarch, physically stood at the entrances of his camp to prevent his soldiers from escaping, pushing them back to the battlefield with the desperate authority of one who knows the only alternative is total destruction. The men obeyed for an instant, and then the Roman tide overwhelmed them anyway. The retreat turned into butchery. The rocky terrain around the Pontic camp was transformed into a death trap when tens of thousands of men tried to escape through it in a stampede that no officer could control. The Roman formations followed them with a methodical and terrible step, without running, without shouting, with that cold efficiency that distinguishes a trained army from an armed crowd. Those who reached the Cephiso River found its banks controlled. Those who tried to escape north ran into the mountain. Those who turned south found more legionaries blocking every exit from the valley. The plain of Chaeronea was covered with the fallen of 12 nations under a sky that held no mercy for anyone. When the dust began to settle over the valley of Boeotia, Mithridates' army had ceased to exist as an organized force. Only 10,000 men managed to reach the sea and be evacuated toward the island of Euboea. The rest, tens of thousands of soldiers from 12 nations, remained on that Greek plain that 2.5 centuries earlier had already seen another definitive change in the world. Sulla walked the field at dusk with an expression his officers described as impossible to decipher. It was not the thoughtless euphoria of a victor who did not expect to be one. It was something more like the contained satisfaction of a craftsman seeing his work finished exactly as he had conceived it from the beginning, without surprises, without improvisations that were not part of the plan. He ordered the fallen of the Roman army to be counted. The figure that arrived was so small it seemed like an invention of the gods. 12 soldiers. 12, according to Sulla's own memoirs, which Plutarch and Appiano would use as a primary source. Modern historians rightly point out that this figure comes from a man not known exactly for his literary modesty. But even if the actual Roman casualties were 20 times higher, the proportion between the fallen of both sides was of a nature that scholars of all eras have considered extraordinary. That night, the Roman soldiers lit bonfires along the slopes of Monte Parapotamio. The light of the flames was reflected in the dark water of the Cephiso. The men ate in silence, and then, little by little, the victory songs that the Roman army reserved for its best knights began. Sulla heard them from his tent. He knew what that victory meant, not just for his small and exhausted army, for all of Roma, for the entire Mediterranean world that had watched with bated breath since Mithridates ordered the murder of 80,000 Roman citizens in a single day. Chaeronea in 86 BC was not just a tactical victory of extraordinary proportions. It was the moment when Mithridates' project to expel Roma from the eastern Mediterranean was definitively closed. The king of Ponto had dreamed of being the new Alejandro, of building an empire from the shores of the Mar Negro to the limits of the known world. He had managed to bring the war to the heart of Grecia and shake the authority of the Republic in the east. But Sulla demonstrated on that Boeotian plain what great generals have taken decades to learn, or paid for with their armies by never learning at all, that numbers are an advantage, not a guarantee. That terrain chosen with intelligence can be worth more than 1,000 additional men. That a disciplined army can double the tactical effectiveness of a larger force fighting without internal cohesion. The war against Mithridates continued. Archelaus received reinforcements and returned to combat the following year, only to be defeated again at Orchomeno. And in the year 85 BC, Mithridates capitulated at the Peace of Dardano, returning all his conquests and paying an indemnity of 2,000 talents of silver. The dream of the king, who had wanted to be Alejandro, dissolved in a document signed under the pressure of 2 battles lost on the same Greek plain. Mithridates would survive decades more, reappearing in new wars that would finally end with his death in the year 63 BC. The dream of dominating the eastern Mediterranean died in the dust of Chaeronea, under the raised arm of a general who did not have enough men but had something worth more, the absolute certainty of knowing exactly what to do in the darkest moment of the day. For Sulla, the victory would open the way back to Italia, and that path would end with him marching on Roma at the head of his legions. The first time in history a Roman general marched on his own capital, sowing the seeds of the civil wars that generations later would destroy the structure he himself had wanted to preserve. The field of Chaeronea is today a silence of olive trees and scattered stones under the blue sky of Boeotia. The Cephiso flows south as it did before the battle and as it did after, without memory of those who fell on its banks. The cicadas sing in summer over the same ground that absorbed the blood of 12 nations more than 2,000 years ago. There are battles won because an army is more numerous. There are battles won because fortune smiles for no apparent reason. And there are battles won because someone, in the darkest moment of the day, chose not to surrender and knew exactly where to move the cavalry. Chaeronea was all 3 things at once, and that is why history, 2,000 years later, still remembers it.